Hello friends, and welcome back to another video. I actually planned to release this the first week of December as kind of a fun Christmas course, but that did not happen because life got really chaotic really fast for our family. And so I decided to basically take a step back. And so here we are now. We're going to be doing just a simple paint with me fun video. So once you've been with your family and you've opened all your gifts, maybe if you get some free time in the afternoon, you can watch this and have some fun. If you would like to experiment with this, I'm going to make sure that this particular drawing is available, that you can download it and also follow along with me. So this is kind of going to be a fun paint with me video. But like I said, this was supposed to be a Christmas special and it's coming out on Christmas. But if you want to tweak this into more of a wintry thing, you could just remove the little ornaments on the deer and change the boy's colors of his clothing to whatever kind of colors that you desire. So you could have blues. I was thinking this would be really pretty for like a January painting with blues, or you could even add maybe little hearts, change the ornaments to hearts, and have him be in all like reds, different types of reds for Valentine's Day. So just know that even though this is a Christmas painting, you can tweak this to fit other kind of wintry themed items. So that being said, I recommend you get maybe a nice hot cup of cocoa or coffee or tea or whatever you like to drink, and go ahead and enjoy, basically sit back and see how I paint this. So that being said, there are a ton of supplies that I use for this particular painting. However, I made swatch cards of all the supplies that I used, and on those swatch cards I also painted gradients to kind of give you an idea of basically where I'm going with these particular supplies. You do not have to use the same supplies as me. Use whatever you have on hand. You can just kind of use these swatch cards as guides for choosing the colors that you already have that would work well with this particular painting. So for the deer, I have basically 5 main colors that I'm using. However, you don't even need all of those. You basically need a light brown and a darker brown, as well as more of a bluey color. Since brown is more of an orangey tone, we want to neutralize that, and the best way to neutralize an orange is to use a contrasting color. So I'm using Payne's Gray, which has a bluer tone to it, to neutralize my browns and make them more of a darker chocolatey color, as well as kind of get into that neutral gray tone as well that basically contrasting colors are known for, creating those really beautiful neutrals. And like I said earlier, I used an assortment of different colors for the boys' clothing. You can follow those particular colors, or you can veer off onto your own whimsical thought process and completely change these. So I just wanted to let you know this is kind of the supplies that I used, but don't feel locked in that you have to use my particular supplies. You can use whatever you have on hand. So with that covered, let's go ahead and jump into the very first step of this particular painting. Now, I have to say, whenever I approach a painting, I always like to think about how can I make this painting as simple as possible. Watercolor is already very difficult and very hard to work with. It can be very temperamental, but it's still a joy to work with. But let's try and make this as simple and as easy as possible. For me, a simple and easy way to paint this without having to think a lot is to use masking fluid. Now, I know masking fluid can be very intimidating for some of you. If you are interested in my secrets of how I use masking fluid, please make sure to go check out a course that I've just created probably about a month ago. I basically tell you all of my secrets for masking fluid. One of the main ones is I actually do dilute my masking fluid just a little bit with water, not very much, but just a tiny bit. to make it a little bit more liquidy in order to spread across the paper better. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is basically prep my masking fluid the way I usually do. And then I'm going to take a brush, and I highly recommend that you find one that is a cheaper brush, but still a watercolor brush, because that's going to help you get more of smooth layers of your masking fluid, which will make it easier to remove later on. And what we're going to do is basically just mask the spots that are going to be on the deer, as well as mask the deer's chest and the deer's belly. Now, when you're masking these areas, the little dots don't really matter because you're basically just putting little dots on your paper. But when you're doing these larger sections, such as the chest and the belly, make sure that when you're applying your masking fluid, you're going in one direction. So wherever you start laying down the masking fluid, you want to continue with that masking fluid until you fill the entire shape, moving it in one direction, similar to how you would paint one large shape of a watercolor wash. This is going to help your masking fluid to lay down smoother on the paper and in the long run make it easier for you to remove. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is mask the deer's tail, and I'm actually going to use more of a dry brushing kind of technique on the tail because I want to have really chaotic little tendrils, basically, of masking fluid on this tail to represent basically the white fur that you typically see on a deer's tail or the underside of their tail. Once I have that done, you do not have to do this, but for me, I just wanted to make my life easier. I went ahead and masked the boy's boot as well as his pant leg. That way, if any of my brown for my deer kind of got up into areas that I didn't want it, I wouldn't have to worry about it. It was already masked off. It was perfectly protected. I also did the boy's mittens as well as the bottom of his jacket for the exact same reason. And just to kind of be a little bit overprotective, I went ahead and masked the top of the little boy's hat as well as the bottom of his hat, or basically those little white fur areas. And once I got this completely masked off and I was really happy with basically how the masking had layered itself on the paper, I went ahead and allowed this to completely dry. One of the things that I love to do when I am masking as well as doing a watercolor painting is I like to do things in stages. So at this point, go do an errand. For me, I did laundry at this time because usually about the time that I finish my laundry, this masking fluid has completely dried and I don't have to worry about it. So always figure out ways to kind of multitask when you're going about painting, and think about how you can break up a painting into stages. And that is the first stage of this painting. The next thing that we're going to be doing is painting our deer. Now that our masking fluid is completely dry, the next thing I want to do is prep my palette with all the colors I'm going to be using for my deer. So I'm going to be using 5 colors, like I said before. And basically what I want to do on my palette is add the lightest colors towards the top and slowly pull them down to my darkest colors. In this case, to make life easier for me, the lighter colors are going to be my highlights, and the darker colors are basically going to be where shadows would be located on my deer. For this step, I recommend using the largest brush that you're comfortable with, and if you feel like you need to pare down to a smaller brush, go ahead and do that. The whole goal here is to try and move your colors seamlessly from one area to another, using a smooth transition from the lighter colors to our darker colors. Now, I do want to say for me personally, I really love these specific browns, especially when I'm doing fur. I'm not usually a fan of granulation. However, some of these paints do have granulation in them, and I actually enjoy using them when working with fur because when it dries and you have that little bit of granulation, it does give the appearance of just a kind of tuft of fur. So for me, the colors that I'm using that are granulating are yellow ochre as well as gold brown. They both basically have a nice little slight granulation. It's not huge, but just a little bit. However, my gold ochre and my Wand Brilliant number 2, basically that peachy color, they are both very, very flat. They have no granulation to them. So when I mix granulating colors with these non-granulating colors, they actually will smooth out the granulation a bit. And if you think about it this way, a lot of times you will see textures and also basically tufts of fur in more of your shadowy areas when you are painting. Whereas if you have more highlights, you typically see more of a smoother coat because you're not seeing as many of those shadows. So this is something to kind of keep in mind when you are choosing your paints, especially with watercolor. Remember that watercolor paints, they can be granulating as well as non-granulating, and this can also help enhance where you're applying textures in a very simple and easy way to create those shadows. And the next color that I'm going to be adding to my platter is basically Payne's Gray. Like I said earlier, this particular color works really, really well with especially those orangey tone browns. Since this is more of a blue, it would be more of a contrasting color, so it's going to neutralize that brown a little bit. And in my case, I really want to use more of that gray kind of blue tone for my shadows, specifically for my deer's legs. So I'm going to go ahead and prep that color as well on my platter. And personally, I feel like when you're using contrasting colors, especially for shadows, it gives a really nice balance to your painting instead of just using a standard black or gray. I find when you're using contrasting colors, it just seems to harmonize a lot better in your painting and kind of add a unique element to it rather than just using a standard black or gray for your shadows. Okay, so now that we have all of our colors kind of prepped on our platter, the very first thing that we're going to do is start by painting that wand color at the tip of our deer's nose, and then slowly transition to yellow ochre. This is basically going to make his nose stand out a little bit more with that peachy color, and then slowly transition into our yellowy brown. And then as you get to kind of the edge of your head, basically where that jawline would start to be, go ahead and start adding some of your gold ochre and pull that back until you get to basically the deer's neck, and then we're going to start adding our gold brown. So like I said earlier, remember you're trying to work in a smooth gradient. So we're working from our highlights to our shadows. Once you have that smooth gradient completed, I recommend dropping some dark brown towards the very, very back of the neck just to create some more contrast. And the way you create this color is basically adding Payne's Gray to your gold brown. This is going to make a really nice burnt umber if you want to use that instead, or if you just want to use what you already have on your palette. Mixing gold brown with Payne's Gray is actually going to make that really nice burnt umber color or a dark chocolate color. The next thing we're going to be doing is painting the deer's ear. You might want to switch brushes on this because it's going to be a smaller area, but we're basically going to be painting the outer rim of our deer's ear, moving from that gold ochre at the very bottom or base, and then switching to gold brown, and then finally adding Payne's Gray to the tips. This is going to make a nice smooth transition from that more richer brown into more of that charcoaly gray blue. And if you feel like any of your colors need to be touched up or darkened a little bit, for me, I felt like I wanted to have a little bit more of a dark chocolate brown at the base of my deer's neck. Go ahead and add that now, basically while the paint is still a little bit wet. Go ahead and drop some paint. You don't want a very sopping wet brush. You just want a little bit of paint in your brush. And while that paint is still slightly wet on your paper, it's going to blossom out, and you can actually smooth in that color to where you have already laid down previous color. Now, be very careful. If you add too much water, you're going to end up having blossoms, and it's basically going to lighten that area, and that's not what we want, especially because we're trying to add shadows in this area. And once you're done with your deer's head as well as that front ear, go ahead and allow this section to completely dry. Typically what I would do is just jump to another section, but to try and make this as easy as possible, I'm basically going to be taking breaks between sections so that I'm working with basically the entire deer during one area of the video and just breaking it down into sections rather than jumping from the deer to the boy to the deer to the ornaments. I'm just going to work on the deer for right now, but because this section basically touches other sections that I need to work on next, I need to make sure that this particular section is completely dry before I lay down any more wet color, because that could potentially create bleeds. And that is something that I don't want. I want these sections to have very sharp edges. So the best way to do that is to just allow it to completely dry. So once again, go take a break, do something fun, watch a video or do a chore in the house, and then come back. Now that that previous section is completely dry, I'm going to work on the back legs of my deer. And they're basically going to be watered down Payne's Gray with a tiny bit of gold browns. So it's basically going to have more of a stormy, I would say, gray-blue color. And basically what I'm going to do is start with the very top portion of my back leg and paint a kind of blue mixture, and then slowly transition as I get to his hooves to more of that gray tone. And once you have this front back leg painted, go ahead and paint the back leg with the same color transition. So start closer to his body with that blue-gray color, and then slowly transition to more of the gray color. Now that we have his back legs done, let's go ahead and hop over to the back ear. Using your darker brown mixture, slowly add color to basically the base of that back ear, and then transition to more of a gray-blue at the tip. Once you have these shadowy sections done, go ahead and allow this to dry again before we move on to the deer's back. Now for this step, I highly recommend you use two brushes, basically a smaller brush for your lines and smaller sections, and then a larger brush for basically pushing your color around. This is going to make life a lot easier rather than fighting yourself trying to work either with a small brush and push your color around in larger areas, or trying to work in smaller areas and basically your color bleeding out because you have such a large brush. So the very first thing that I did was basically start at the neck of my deer, and I added gold ochre to the base of my neck just below the head, and then slowly transitioned that to gold brown as I pushed that color down to the lower shoulder of my deer. I also tried to add more of that gold brown basically directly underneath where the boy would be sitting. This would also create a shadow, as well as right underneath where his mittens would be. And basically by painting in this manner where I'm really thinking about where my highlights are as well as my shadows and using gradients to communicate those, I'm not going to have to glaze over top of these colors later on. And glazing for this particular color set is very difficult because some of these colors are not very staining. So if you glaze on top of them, they are apt to basically lift, and it can create odd little textures. So just be aware of that and try and lay down your colors exactly the way you would want them to basically dry, so we don't have to add color on top of this. All right, now that I have kind of a smooth brown color along my deer's leg, the next thing I want to do is use my Payne's Gray along with my gold brown mixture, so basically that charcoaly blue color that we've been using for our shadows. I want to paint the hooves of our deer and then slowly push that color up to meet the brown of our legs. This is going to allow the two colors to mingle and merge together and create an interesting yet smooth transition. Once you have this done, go ahead and continue painting the rest of the deer's back with that gold brown, making sure to add basically darker colors underneath the pant leg of the boy and his shoe, and then transitioning to that lighter color as we get to basically his little butt area. Once again, go ahead and add that charcoal gray black mixture that we used earlier to the deer's hoof, and then transition it up into your brown on your deer's leg. And now that we have that done, let's go ahead and let that dry a little bit and hop on over to our deer's front antler. So the next thing that I want to do is mix up a nice burnt umber or a chocolate brown with my Payne's gray as well as my gold brown. And basically what I'm going to do is take this particular color and paint the entire back portion of my antler as well as the front, kind of as you see me doing right here. Finally, the last thing we're going to be doing is painting our deer's tail. So with your gold brown and your gold ochre mixture, we're basically going to paint the very back portion of our deer's tail, and basically the area that is closest to the boy needs to be the darker brown color, and then as you slowly transition to the front, make it that gold ochre color. Now, remember we masked this tail, so we don't have to be super precise about making sure we keep that white because it's already masked. So basically go ahead and paint over the tail without any worries of losing that white since we masked it earlier. All right, now that we have our tail done, the next thing that I did is I wasn't really liking the shadows underneath the boy's mittens as well as his leg. So I went ahead and dropped some darker gold brown. So basically that brown mixture mixed with Payne's gray, just to give more of the appearance of a shadow and allow the boy to look like he's actually sitting or resting on our deer's back. And the next thing that I recommend you do is allow this to completely dry. I'm going to do some tweaking and slight detail work next, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to make sure this painting is completely dry before I start adding those smaller details. All right, now that this is completely dry, I'm going to go ahead and mix up a light blue gray on my platter and go ahead and glaze shadows underneath the back two legs of my deer. Basically, as you can see right here. Then with a clean, wet brush, you don't want it sopping wet, just slightly damp, go ahead and slowly push this particular color that we've just laid down and soften the edge to make that shadow have more of a smooth transition. And now that we have that done, go ahead and take this same light blue mixture and paint the entirety of that back antler, starting from the top and then pulling down your color to the base. And the last thing that we're going to be doing for this particular step is painting the inside of our deer's ear. So we're going to be using that Wand Brilliant number 2 as well as Shell Pink. This is one of my favorite combos if you want more of a peachy skin color or that nice fuzzy kind of peach skin color that sometimes you see inside of ears of animals such as dog ears and cat ears. That's the color combo that I'm going to be using for inside of my deer's front ear. So I recommend adding more of that Shell Pink towards the inner portion of your deer's ear and then slowly transitioning to more of that peachy color as you get to the outer edge. Once you have kind of that pink peach color transition inside of your ear, for me personally, I wanted a little bit more of a dramatic transition than what I was seeing right here. So I decided to add a little bit of permanent rose to my shell pink and basically make it a tad bit more pink than what it was already. And then I added some of my Wand Brilliant number 2 to this to basically make it a little bit more of a peachy tone pink, but it's slightly more dramatic than the shell pink. And I just dropped that color into the inner portion of my deer's ear. So once again, we're using colors to communicate our shadows. By using a darker pink color, it's going to show that it's closer to the inner ear of our deer, which is slightly hidden from light. So it's going to be darker in that area. And in order to show a transition as we go lighter up the ear, that's more exposed to light, and that's going to be slightly lighter. So that is the reasoning behind this color transition, and hopefully gives you some insight on how to communicate shadows when you're working, especially with lighter colors. And that is it for now. The next thing I'm going to do is allow this to once again completely dry before I do the next step, which is removing our masking fluid. For this step, I recommend using a rubber cement pickup, as well as your fingers. Sometimes I don't like to use my fingers because of the oil that can be on them, so make sure your hands are very dry before you do this, because oil can act as a resist when you're painting with watercolor. So make sure your hands are very clean as well as dry before you do this, and make sure your painting is completely dry before you do this. But I like to use a rubber cement pickup as well as my fingers to kind of feel if I have removed actually the masking fluid dots. So basically those little spots that are on our deer's back. Sometimes it's really hard to tell if you have actually removed them with the rubber cement pickup. So I like to feel over that area with my finger just to make sure. And then if I notice that there is some rubbery feel on the paper, I'll go ahead and with my finger and remove those spots. After you get all of those dots basically removed with your masking fluid, the next thing I recommend doing is working in the larger sections. Now these can be very intimidating, but they don't have to be. What I recommend doing is slowly trying to lift one side of your masking fluid with your rubber cement. And then once you get a little bit of that rubber cement up, try and pull it at an angle instead of lifting it directly off the paper. This is actually going to create less stress on your paper and prevent it from ripping. So go ahead and work in all of the sections that we basically laid down masking fluid, which would be the deer's chest, as well as the deer's belly, the deer's tail, the boy's leg, boot, basically all the places that we laid down masking fluid. Go ahead and slowly remove those with your rubber cement pickup as well as your hand before you move on to the next step. Now that our masking fluid is removed, let's go ahead and paint the white areas of our deer. I always like to, especially if I'm going to have a white background, paint my white fur accents just a little bit so that they stand out, and that's what we're going to be doing next. For this painting, I used yellow ochre plus a little bit of Payne's gray to create more of a sandy color, and I painted this on the deer's tail, belly, and chest. However, because yellow ochre is kind of granulating, I noticed if you mix Wan with Payne's, you'll get almost the exact same color. It's a bit more of a peachy orange color, and it's a smoother gradient. And so I put both of those on the swatch card so you can decide to use either one. Both of them will work well, but for me, I wish I had used the Wand Brilliant number 2 plus the Payne's Gray after kind of playing around with this. So I'm giving that little tidbit to you. Now, the next step I'm going to say, I did this and part of me likes it and part of me doesn't. So I'm going to let you decide if you would like to do this or not. This was kind of a learning experience for me. But remember how I said earlier that my browns are not very staining? Some of them are not very staining, so they lift very easily when you basically place color over them. Well, at this stage of the painting, I really wanted to add shadows underneath the boy's pant leg, boot, and mittens to basically make him look like he's resting on the deer's back. So I actually took this same color that I've been using for my shadows, and I painted basically a small line under the boy's mittens as well as his boot and his pant leg. I did this because I wanted to make those little spots on the deer's back be more muted than that stark white. However, when I did this, some of the brown lifted up. And so as this dries, you're going to see kind of a mottled texture of the darker brown as well as this lighter color mixing together. And part of me really likes it because it looks like tufts of hair as well as it's kind of shading those spot areas. But then the other part of me is like, I don't know if I like it as much. So I'm going to leave this to your discretion. If you don't want to do this, you could easily take a pencil that's very close to the same color and then lightly go over each of the spots to kind of dull down those stark white colors and not worry about basically the brown lifting up. However, I wanted to let you know that a lot of times when I'm painting, I will try stuff out and then sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I was not expecting the brown to lift up as much as it did in these areas, but that's all part of the learning process. And that is it for this step. The next thing that we're going to be doing is really concentrating on the boys' clothing as well as the ornaments. All right, now we are moving out of the neutrals and into our colors. And like I said earlier, you can change these colors to whatever colors you want. You can do blues, you can do all greens, you can make it rainbow. I don't really care. But for this, I tried to make it more Christmassy. So I'm going to be using an assortment of basically golden yellows as well as reds and greens for these particular things. But you can tweak this to any way you want to. Feel free to really use your imagination. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is mix up a Scarlet Lake plus a smidge of Permanent Rose. Personally, I absolutely love Scarlet Lake. If you have to buy a red paint, in my opinion, and you want like a professional color red of watercolor, Winsor & Newton Scarlet Lake is gorgeous and it mixes really, really well with a lot of different colors. So by mixing Scarlet Lake with a little bit of Permanent Rose, you can also do more of a magenta too if you want to, but I did Scarlet Lake plus Permanent Rose. You're going to make a really nice, rich red Christmas color. So more of that traditional Christmas, that deep red instead of that stark kind of fire engine red. You're going to get more of that darker, rich kind of traditional Christmas color. And with a small brush, basically we're going to take this color and paint each of the ornaments that are hanging on the deer's antlers. Once you have that completed, go ahead and take the same color and paint each section of the boy's scarf. So for me, the way I did this is first I painted the right side and then I painted the left side to kind of make sure those two dried. And finally, I painted the middle section that hangs down. By actually painting this scarf in 3 different stages, you're going to create natural lines with your paint, basically borders, instead of those colors kind of bleeding in. So that's kind of a secret with watercolor. Try and work in sections, especially if you want more of a color line, a more natural color line with your watercolor. This is a really great technique to use to get those kind of sharper edges without doing basically a lot of effort, like using a pencil or even trying to line the edge of a shape with basically paint later on or glazing on top of it. Basically by working in sections, if your paint glazes over a little bit of the previous section, it's going to create a natural line. And personally, I use this technique all the time when I am painting, especially when I'm trying to get more of those natural sharp edges with color. And now I'm going to let these little sections completely dry and move on to more of a golden yellow accent for our little boy's hat. So I'm going to create my own color, but feel free if you just want to use a color that you already have, that's perfectly fine. But basically what I did is I mixed green gold with cadmium yellow and then a little bit of gold ochre to make more of this really nice golden yellow color. And then with a round brush, I just painted the boy's hat as well as his mittens. And while I let these dry, I'm going to go back to my boy's scarf because my two previous sections are pretty much dry, and go ahead and paint the center or middle section of my boy's scarf with that scarlet red and permanent rose mixture. All right, now we're going to start moving on to our kind of charcoaly blacks for our little boy's hair, his boots, as well as his pant legs. So the way I make this charcoaly black is I mix gold brown as well as Payne's gray together. These two colors are going to basically neutralize one another and create a really nice charcoal black. And once you get this color, go ahead and paint the boy's boot. Then set this color aside for later use. All right, the next thing we're going to be doing is painting our boy's jacket. So I'm going to use the same yellow gold mixture that I mixed up earlier, but add some Phthalo yellow green. That's a beautiful Daniel Smith bright green color. And I'm going to add this to my yellow mixture to create a nice, rich, warm green. Now, make sure that you don't completely mix away basically all of your gold mixture because we are going to be using that gold mixture again for shading later on. So I recommend mixing this new green color kind of off to the side so that you can get some of that yellow later on. Once you have that green mixture mixed up to the color that basically you desire, go ahead and paint the entire jacket in a nice smooth flat wash, just like you see me doing here. All right, while we allow that to dry, let's go ahead and start working on some shadows for our lighter white sections of our boy's basically fur hat. So basically that little tuft on top of his hat as well as around the border. Basically what I'm going to do is take my charcoal black mixture that I mixed earlier. I'm going to take a little bit of the side and add water to it until it gets very, very light. And then I'm going to add a smidge of yellow ochre to it. This is going to create more of a warm gray color for our shadows. And basically I'm going to take this color and paint it along the bottom side of my fur hat, as well as the left side of that little tuft ball at the top of his hat. And once you have those lighter shadows painted, the next thing that I did was I added some gold brown to my already mixed up charcoal black color. And basically I wanted to create a little bit more of a brown, like a dark brown gray for the boy's pants. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want the boot to look different in color from the pants. So once you have this color mixed up, go ahead and paint the entire pant leg of your boy in a smooth, flat wash. And once you have that done, go ahead and take this same color that we just mixed up and paint the boy's hair. And I recommend for this step using a very small brush because we don't want to use a lot of water when we're painting in this section. We want our edges to be very sharp and basically communicating that sharp edge to hair. And once you have that done, go ahead and take that same golden yellow, basically that we left on our palette from earlier, and we're going to glaze the top of our hat with a shadow line on the left side. Now, at this point, your hat should be dry. That's the reason why we've kind of been hopping around. We're trying to allow these things to dry as we're working. But before you lay this new color on, I highly recommend you check and make sure that the hat is dry. All right, now we're gonna move on to shadows for our scarf. So we're gonna use that same red mixture that we mixed earlier. And basically I'm gonna take this and glaze over top of the colors that I've already laid down and add shadows to basically the left side of my scarf. That whole area is going to be completely shaded or glazed over with this color. Then I'm going to paint the left side of the middle section of my scarf. So I'm kind of imagining that my light source is towards the boy's back. If you're wondering how I'm kind of figuring out where these shadows would be located. And then the last thing I'm going to do is add a small line of color to basically the back portion of my boy's scarf. So this would be really close to where his head is meeting the edge of that scarf. Now that we have those done, let's take the same red mixture again and add shadows to the left side of the two right ornaments, and then add shadows to the right side of the two back ornaments. So picture the deer's head casting a shadow over those back two. Once you have that done, let's go ahead and paint the skin color of our little boy. I am going to mix Wand Brilliant number 2 with Shell Pink to make more of a peachy skin color, and then add a little bit of Shell Pink to the side of this to make more of a blush color. And what I'm going to do is take the peachy color and paint that all over his face in a nice smooth flat wash, and then drop some of that pink color that we mixed for the blush in locations where you would find a blush. So on his nose as well as on his cheeks, kind of like he's been riding out in the snow for a long time and he's got that kind of red, cold nose face. This should be really subtle, but it does really help create dimension when you're painting skin tones on his face. Now that we have that done, let's go ahead and paint shadows for our jacket. So you're going to use the same green mixture that we used earlier, except this time I'm going to add a smidge of Phthalo green yellow. So this is a darker green to create that shadow on our jacket. And I recommend painting this color on the left side of his jacket as well as the bottom section of his jacket. Basically anywhere where a shadow would fall, go ahead and glaze this color in those areas. Now let's start adding shadows to basically his pant leg as well as his boot. Once again, you're going to take that charcoaly black color that we mixed earlier and add a shadow to the right portion of our pant leg. So kind of where his jacket would overhang and then come straight down, casting a shadow. Then using a clean wet brush, go ahead and soften that edge along that shadow line, blending it out until you get more of a smooth transition. Next, add a shadow to the bottom edge of his boot. And then with this color, I slightly watered it down and I added shadows to the bottom left of my front antlers. So basically those gray antlers, I just added a little bit of this gray color to add some depth and shading to these areas. And that was a lot of steps, but there is still one more little step that we need to do. Go ahead and take that golden yellow that we mixed earlier and paint the top portion of all of your ornaments. So they should look like a golden yellow for that metal portion that basically the ornaments are hanging from. And once you are done with that, go ahead and allow this to completely dry. Take a break, walk away from this, because the next thing we're going to be doing is adding colored pencils on top. So we want to make sure this is completely dry, as well as some ink and pencil details. All right, my painting is completely dry now and ready for me to do final details. So for me, I really like using mixed media, especially colored pencils and ink when I'm working with my paintings, and that is basically what I'm going to be doing next. The first thing I'm going to do is add some more detail to my white spots. The way I did this is I just took a white pencil and I basically colored over the previous dots, especially the ones that kind of got muddied a little bit with me glazing over them, to make them stand out a little bit more. And then I added highlights with the white pencil on the chest, tail, and the fur hat. So basically on the left side of the chest, on the right side of the tail, and also on the right side of the fur elements of our little boy's hat. Next, I took a graphite pencil and I added basically my eyes back into my little characters. As I was painting, basically those areas got a little bit muddled and they lightened a little bit, so I'm just adding a graphite pencil line to these areas to make them stand out a little bit more. I also added lines for the strings, for the cords on the ornaments. And then I took my graphite pencil and basically wherever I felt like I wanted a line to stand out a bit more, I went ahead and retraced over that line. So a couple of areas where I did that was the tips of the ears and the elbow of the deer. I basically made some little lines to show hair, and I even did that a little bit to the edge of the tail. Now that I have that kind of finalized, I'm going to take a red pencil next and outline the areas of our boy's scarf where shadows would be located. So I'm just trying to make that line, specifically on the left side, stand out just a little bit more. Then I took an orange pencil, or basically a lighter color than what the scarf is so that it'll stand out a bit more, and I added lines along the length of the scarf. Now, make sure the lines follow the direction, basically, that the scarf is being tied around, similar to like stitching. You're stitching on your scarf, typically it goes the length of the entire scarf. So if it's horizontal, your lines are going to go horizontal, and if it's vertical, your lines will go vertical down the middle portion of our scarf. Then I took that same color and I added lines to the boy's hat. I kind of curved them a little bit to make it appear like it's puffed out a bit. So not necessarily straight lines, but actually curving a bit to show the form of his hat and give it the illusion of a bit more structure. The next thing that I did is took a blush pink pencil and I colored basically the little boy's cheeks as well as his nose to kind of make them stand out a little bit more. And then I took a light green pencil and basically added highlights to the jacket's back as well as some of the arms. So I like to sometimes use pencils to add highlights. This is just a little tidbit for you because they give me a lot of control where I put those highlights. And a lot of times highlights, they aren't super drastic, I would say, but at the same time, they usually are tiny shapes. And by using a colored pencil, it helps me put those shapes down and lighten those areas without a whole lot of effort. And the next step is kind of a me step. You can do this or you can skip over it. Personally, I always like to add little white accents to the whiter areas or the sandy kind of areas of our deer. So I'm going to add little small dots of white to our deer's chest as well as its tail. And I also decided to add little white details to the fur hat, as well as highlight basically dots to my small ornaments. And I did this with white ink. I did this with Copic white ink. However, you can use acrylic white, you can use gouache white, paint, you can use P.H. Martin's bleed proof white, whatever you have on hand that's an opaque white will do for this particular step. And finally, the very last thing that I did is I just took gold paint and I added little snowflakes basically around the deer. So it looked like he's leaping into the air. And these are really basic shapes, nothing too complicated. I basically just did a couple of crosses and then put little X's in them and then added little knobs to the ends of those lines. And this was just to kind of finish off the piece. So once you have that done, you are completely finished with this painting. Hopefully you enjoyed this particular tutorial. It was a little bit different than what I usually do, but I thought it was a fun little painting to do for the season. Once again, if you want the drawing for this painting, make sure to check out the link down below. I am going to be selling this inside of Watercolor Misfit Land, as well as the swatch charts that you can use as a reference. And that is it for now. Lots of love, y'all. Happy painting, and I will see you next time. Bye!